Good morning and welcome to Happy Hour with me. It is Eileen Cook, and today is Wednesday, August 21st. And the idea for today's session came from two parts. So I think you guys know I've been working on a book on conflict, and I'm still busily working away on that. But I had come up with an idea for another book, as you always do when you're working on one book. There's always another idea that comes into your head. And so I wanted to talk about writer lies and myths. So those are everything from I can't do this, I'm not good enough, to adverbs are always evil. So it was kind of fun because I put out a call on Glip, and I still will be collecting if people have more. Various different kinds of things of advice that we get or we're told or we tell ourselves that later we start to think about and wonder if it wasn't or was not true. And I think this was made even stronger because Jenny had sent me an email asking me about the general adverb question. So show of hands for people who are not driving. How many of you have read Stephen King's On Writing, where it told you that you should never ever use adverbs? How many of you felt very sad about that? So I think it's an interesting thing. I loved that piece, and like many people, when I get writing advice, I tend to sit down right away and feel like I have to do something with that advice. So the first thing that I did, of course, was banish any and all adverbs from my writing in any way, shape, or form. How many people have Pro Writing Aid or have used Pro Writing Aid? It also flags adverbs. Or you can set it up to do that. And that also, for a lot of people, creates all sorts of challenges and issues because all of a sudden they have all these adverbs. So question, does anyone want to make the argument for adverbs? Anyone want to go out there and say adverbs have value?
Specificity.
Meaning what exactly, Marianne?
Well, I think my interpretation of the never use adverbs advice is don't use an adverb.
You froze up, Marianne. Or I froze up.
Can't think of a better, more specific or more powerful noun. But if you've got the noun or the verb that you want, or the only one that will do, but there's ambiguity, then you can qualify it.
All right.
To be more precise.
Bonnie had Jenny, you are not allowed to participate because you're in your car and it is unsafe.
You're muted anyway, Jenny.
All right. I muted her because it's like.
Because I've now been in the car for 3 hours and I'm munching. So my specific thing was so the one was something about, I can't even do it now, but sometimes it just seems like, yeah, you could write it more specifically, but it's not that important of a line, and the adverb is like shorthand, like if it was something really important that you wanted people to really connect with, then yeah, it's, rearrange it, make it more specific, make it more bold, but sometimes it just seems like it doesn't make sense without it because it's qualifying, but it's not worth making it beautiful.
All right, now I'm muting you again because you're driving.
I'm not driving, I'm parked. I'm in a parking spot. See, I'm not moving.
Okay. Just for clarity, people, we don't forward these kind of shenanigans. So, and for Jenny, because I actually I muted you, so that will teach you because you're in your car. One of the things that I think is interesting is you had a line that was talking about a thickly padded chair. So that was the example you had sent me in your email, and around like, do you need to go out of your way to find another way to say it was a thickly padded chair? Or in fact, does it then become all too much about the chair. So I want to go over to Bonnie because she had a comment on this, and she's not in her car. Bonnie?
Well, I just feel actually we should be able to use all the lovely words and all the word types in our writing because they were invented for a reason, and they help provide clarity. And in some cases, it's like you could say, yeah, the man walked to the door, but whether he walked slowly or whether he walked quickly or briskly makes a difference. And yes, you can use something like he sauntered or he strode, but sometimes that just doesn't quite qualify. I also feel that adverbs and adjectives are kind of like showing versus telling. You could spend tons of words showing everything, but sometimes you need to get from point A to point B quickly, and adverbs are great for that because they can speed up the pacing. It just gives you a brief snippet of what's needed, and off you go. And certainly a thickly padded cushion is much different than just a padded cushion.
And I think, first off, Bonnie, you put your finger on one of the things that I qualify any writing rule with is there's always a reason not to do it, right? And there's always a reason that it sort of comes up and someone uses it as a rule. So first off, I sometimes see people say, well, I saw an agent at XYZ conference and they said, never do this or always do this. And whenever you see the always and nevers, I'm just always leery because I think sometimes people are just using shorthand or they're not communicating necessarily very well. So we're writers and we have a whole wide range of a toolkit to use. And the reason that adverbs get a bad name is that people use them as a default oftentimes in bad writing. So what you'll see is that people constantly go back to adverbs versus determining whether or not it is the right word choice. And I think there's two things that might determine that. One is it might be a line of dialogue. So a character is going to say, he walked away from me quickly. And he would never say he strode away from me. Like it's something that the character themselves would not say. So you want to use the adverb because it's something the character would say. The second time I think you might want to use an adverb is because, and Marianne put so succinctly, character's got to say what a character's got to say, is you might be wanting to use an adverb because, and I think this is some of what Jenny was trying to communicate when she was parked in her car and I yelled at her, is that you want to get from point A to point B and it's not necessarily adding to the scene to give that sort of breadth. So all of a sudden, she could say it was like, a thickly padded chair. So she could sort of say the chair piled high with cushions, velvet, feather down, where a mile, like she could do this whole thing. And really then the reader's eye is being drawn to that. The more you pay attention to something, the more the reader feels this is something that I should be looking at. So all of a sudden, sorry about the helicopter noise. It sounds like it's landing on my roof. All of a sudden you have a situation where the reader thinks that this chair is eminently important. And in fact, that's not what we wanted to do. We were just trying to sort of give some depth or description to a space that suddenly became too much about that space. I also think sometimes you might want an adverb for pacing reasons, because to describe it or use different ways around it would elongate the scene or sort of take away, particularly if you're writing something that might be a fast-paced action scene where you really want to get to the point. And so you want to get there as quickly as you can. In there that, adverbs using sparingly. And I think that's where actually having a little bit of an adverb phobia is worthwhile because you can sort of highlight them and then ask yourself the important question of, is this a good place for an adverb? This is not something that I worry about when I'm writing. So this is another thing that I want to sort of give people the heads up to think about is, I think sometimes the more we learn about writing, the harder it can be to write. So I used to write scenes and I would never think about it. I would just be writing and flying along. And then the more that I learned, in some ways it became harder because I'd start thinking, oh, wait, that's an adverb. I shouldn't use an adverb. What's another word? Wait, have I had a change of emotion in this scene? There's not an, wait, what's the character's motivation in this scene? Motivation. Oh, wait, no, this is going, it would sort of clump up. So I think the one thing when we talk about any of these rules, including adverbs, is if an adverb comes into your head as you're writing, stick at the sucker on the page, keep going, get the scenes out, and then if you need to, go back and take some time and think about whether or not the adverb is there. So just because people may be listening to this later and not be seeing the chat window, Marianne is saying like plush and a luxurious might draw unwanted attention to the chair, whereas a thickly padded chair is just part of a scene. So I think that is kind of that idea of the more time you spend on something, the more likely the reader is to see that thing as important. And Alyssa, you had mentioned that you were listening to an audiobook on editing where the author gave an example of a word that ends in ly that is not an adverb, but is often mischaracterized as one and constantly removed. Do you remember which word that was? Now we're all inclined to want to know. If you think of it, type it in and I'll share it with everyone.
I think it might have been only. Is only an adverb?
Everyone's thinking, I don't think it is, no. So yeah, you don't have to take only out, which is a good one to think about. Now, Bonnie, you had a comment. You were raising your hand earlier. Did it go away? It went away. All right. Other thoughts on adverbs? So I think we can all agree on the adverb rule is there is a point of thinking about whether or not you need to have the adverb in there. So in general, I think it is often useful to potentially be taking it out, but there are lots of reasons to leave them in. So don't get caught in feeling like it's an absolute. Odette, you're asking, is really an adverb, or are you saying really is an adverb? Silence. Really is one of those words that I often take out when I'm doing my own editing, just because it often isn't needed to be there. Like, he was really silent. Of course, like, you don't need that. Like, take it out. It doesn't need to be there. Just as another one that I use all the time and I have to eventually delete. So thinking about those and helping yourself get them out of there is useful. Look at this. We have all sorts of things about how only is in there and all that kind of, everyone's like, lonely, everything with an ly. Actually, clearly everyone has now become ly adverse. And I think that the biggest thing that you can take about it is maybe not even worrying about what type of speech it is, but asking yourself if it needs to be there. Or is there a word that is better or a description that is better, and or would your writer be cleaner without it? And that's really why, for example, King is talking about getting rid of adverbs, is that they're often extra calories you don't need in your writing that aren't adding any flavor. So get rid of them if at all possible. All right. I'm doing a quick search. No other last thoughts on adverbs? Yes, take them out of dialogue tags. I would agree with that. That is one place where they drive me crackers. She said quickly. She said quietly. She said, unless for some reason, like she says, I love you. She said, sorry. Like if it's not showing up somehow otherwise, I might put it in there. But in that is generally useful. I think what we're talking about is you can have, as Marianne's calling it, stripped down prose, which some people like. But it is also obviously a writer's choice, but there's also just what I consider clean writing, which is not having extraneous stuff that's not adding to your thing. And we all have different levels of how much can be added before it's extraneous, but that's the kind of thing that you're thinking about. So the other story rule or whatever that I've heard that I'm interested to hear people talk about is that good writing always wins out. Do people agree with that? That if you're a good writer, eventually it'll get published because it's a good book. Bonnie's making a sad face, or she's frozen in a bad place where her lip is sticking out. We have a few no's coming up. If you can also tell a story, says Marriott. I think this is one that is interesting because we both love the idea and we hate the idea. So I think at some points we're at a place where we are saying, good writing will always win out, and it's a cheerful thing that we tell ourselves. We're like, eventually, it's going to get there, it's going to happen. And then it can be also discouraging because if you get your 75th rejection letter, or a reader writes to you and tells you that they hate it, it can feel like, oh, I guess maybe it doesn't win out. What I would say is perseverance. Writers who continue to write do eventually get published, but it may not be that particular book. Writers have so many more ways to reach readers than they ever did before. You will have a way to tell your story, and it is a matter of hanging in with that. It may not be the story you are currently working on, and I have no way of telling you that. Sometimes people will say to me, do you think this story has what it takes to get published? And that's a really hard question to answer. I can tell someone whether or not I think a story is good and should be published or is quality, but I don't think I can necessarily say that, this for sure will get published, because there are so many factors that are out there that you don't necessarily have control over, including what's happening in the market. You may come across an agent's desk on the morning after they got dumped, and so they're in a shitty mood, and so they're feeling no's to everything versus feeling it a different way. So there is a lot of that. Tracy put in here, some really good writers don't get discovered. And there are other people who are not necessarily that great at writers who have cult followings, which is, and we all can kind of maybe think of one or two books where we have that thing where anyone here ever have the moment where you're reading a book that was, I'm going to say traditionally published, and you have a moment where you're like, I can't believe this crap got published and mine didn't? Anyone? Maybe I'm the only person who ever had that experience before I'd been published, where you're just like, I cannot believe that this gained it past the gatekeepers, and yet my book did not. So there is, all this kind of stuff where it doesn't necessarily always come down to just the writing skill. What I can say is it does come down to some degree to perseverance. So what is your ability to pick yourself back up and keep going? Whether that is to continue to pitch, whether that is, and I think that's partially why we've seen the growth of indie publishing, is there are a lot of people who were like, you know what, I'm writing something that may be niche or may not be something that the market is recognizing, but I think this story has value. I want to get it out there, and they're willing to go out and put the work into it. All I will say is, please don't go out and think all I have to do is put my book up on one of these things and then readers are somehow magically going to find me. I seriously hope that they do. That would be spectacular, and I would be super happy for you. But what you will see with most people who are successful with indie publishing are working their ass off in order to make that happen. And they are doing a ton of work in order to make that happen. So is it skill? Yeah, it's skill in terms of putting in the hard work and knowing what to do and working on all of those things. And it's the same with traditional. I don't think those two things are different. So, well, there's a comment here about Dora Lessing making experiments. So she was a famous author, and she sent in something under another name, and she wasn't published in England. And that was also the same thing. I don't know if people remember J.K. Rowling had the experience of, she obviously was, you may have heard of her. She did this little series called the Harry Potter books. And she, went out and she wrote under a man's name for her mystery series. And in fact, her publisher, I don't think, was aware of who she was. And so the book was out there, and it was doing okay, but it was very small, and it was not getting anywhere near the attention until it came out that she was, in fact, J.K. Rowling. And then that book went to the top of the bestseller list. I'm also not sure if people have heard the story of Joe Hill. Joe Hill is a horror / mystery writer. He did a couple of books that were critically very acclaimed. They did a lot of success in terms of winning some awards and that kind of thing, but they weren't necessarily very commercially popular or viable. And then one person noticed that it sounded a lot like Stephen King's writing. And in fact, that Joe Hill, who they had seen at a conference, looked like a little bit like Stephen King. And it turns out Joe Hill is Stephen King's son. It's his son with Tabitha King. And he was writing horror, and he didn't want to be known as Stephen King's son. So neither, I don't believe either his agent nor his editor knew that he was Stephen King's son. And he'd had really good critical success, but he hadn't had very much commercial success. Well, then it came out that he was Stephen King's son, and he's now a New York Times bestseller. One of the things that will live in infamy at the Surrey Writers Conference, I don't know how many people know, but they have a session that they call the Surrey Idol. And this is where they read the first few paragraphs up to a page of a writer's prose, and the agents talk about whether or not they would keep reading or whether or not they would it. One year, someone snuck in the first page of a Margaret Atwood novel, and it was read, and the agents and editors all turned it down. And some of them were, I don't think it was from Handmaid's Tale. I thought it was from Cat's Eye, but I could be wrong. But anyway, people were I think there were a lot of people who were like, yeah, take that, agents and editors, right? And they were all feeling and some of the editors and agents were actually quite angry because they felt they had been set up to be embarrassed in front of a room full of people. But I think it is that sense of, is it fair? No, not necessarily. Marianne is pointing out that Diana Gabaldon's son is also a writer and has done fairly well. And he's connected to his mom. I don't think he sells it. It's not like he goes on everywhere, but he's also not going to pretend that he's not Diana Gabaldon's. It is, I don't think, any different than any other business, in that if you know certain people, you're going to have certain advantages. There are certain things that just hit the zeitgeist at the right time. I am constantly fascinated by the 50 Shades phenomenon. And I still would admit that I don't necessarily get it. So when it came out and everyone was reading 50 Shades of Grey, I downloaded the book. I didn't like it. I've been open about that. I didn't think it was particularly well written. And a lot of people said, oh yeah, but it's, it's hot and steamy and it's all this kind of stuff, which threw me because erotica has been a genre for a really long time. And I had friends who wrote erotica, and they wrote it a million times better than 50 Shades of Grey. And so I was somewhat fascinated with how that book took off. And that book in part was very busy and active on Wattpad, which some people know. So she had a lot of fans going into that before it was published. But I found it just whether she was at the right place at the right time, and she connected with those people in a way that other people hadn't done. So this is one of those things where, probably like adverbs, which are both good and bad, I think it's both true and not true. I do think if you are a good writer, and even more than a good writer, if you are a good storyteller, and you are willing to keep putting yourself out into the fray, I believe you will find readers. I do believe that. Having said that, it is not just a case of, if you didn't get published, it means you didn't write a good book. And I think that's sometimes the place where we go to, where we feel bad about ourselves, where we say like, well, the reason I must be getting all these rejections is because I'm not actually that good. And that is a road that I don't want people to go down, because it's simply not true. And I certainly know that there are plenty of books that haven't yet crossed that threshold into being out into the world, and it is in no way a reflection of the book. And I think that is one of the challenges, is people say, when do you give up on a book? When do you know it's just not going to happen? And I don't know if there is a way to know, in that sometimes it's just a matter of timing. I know people have put books away, and then things have changed in the marketplace, and then they suddenly have brought that book back out, and they have found the person who is the person to champion that book and bring it out into the world. So that can make a huge difference. So I always say, you're never getting rid of a book. You may put a book to a side for a period of time. I know for myself, one of my early books, I was like, well, I guess it's just not the time for it. I did go back to it, and I was not actually happy with my own book. Like, I wouldn't put it out there now. So you may have some distance and some time. I do think, and I think this is to some degree what Alyssa's mentioning in the chat window, is that even if there's a book that you don't like, if it's hugely successful, there's probably something to be learned from it. I didn't do it with 50 Shades because it drove me insane for some reason, but I did do it with the Da Vinci Code. It's really looked at, if you read the Da Vinci Code, it is not particularly, in a lot of ways, a well-crafted book. The dialogue is very still. The characters are super flat. If you look at it, it really shows up. But if you then kind of go back and look at it, when I read it the first time, I was just like, I flew through that book in like 2.5 hours. Like, and I was like, this is the best book ever. And then I reread it. And when I reread it, I was like, no, it's not. And I think it's like going on a Disney ride where you slow, like if you were to go through Pirates of the Caribbean, I was on it once when it broke down. And so we like stopped in the middle, and then they had to turn the lights up. And they were like, okay, like we're going to get you out through here. It's just going to take a while. So the lights are up in the Pirates of the Caribbean, and then we're just moving really slowly through the ride. And let me tell you, it is the tackiest, dustiest. Like suddenly you realize, like, these are a bunch of really cheap looking mannequins who are all like, yo, ho, 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 ho. Right? Like, oh my God, this is awful. But when you're on the ride and it's going fast and the lights are blinking and it's a little bit dark and your imagination is filling in the things, it feels really fun. And I think that's what the Da Vinci Code and possibly 50 Shades have done, and Twilight and some of the others, where you strap in, and if you get on the ride and it's going, you're having so much fun that you're not noticing that it's maybe not necessarily the best crafted story. This is one of the things that I talk about a lot when I am taking on students for my SFU course. I often get asked, people say, well, how did you pick who is going to be in your group? Is it the writing? Because they have to submit 20 pages. And it is. I mean, I'm certainly looking at the writing, but more than the writing, I'm looking at whether or not it is a good story. Because if it's a good story, I will forgive so many things. Bring on the adverbs, baby. Like, I will forgive all sorts of things if there is the opportunity to sort of have that in there. So that is one of the things. Anyone else have any questions or comments on that one? Okay, I'm going to go to Christy first. and then-
Stephen James wrote this book. I'm parked now again.
All right.
Stephen James wrote this book called Story Trumps Structure. And I think that's the case. He was kind of making the opposite case, is that if you've got a really compelling story, that might be more important than the writing, which I think is the Da Vinci Code argument.
Yeah, and I think it's bang on. I do think story will trump structure. Like if you have a really good story, it'll keep people. I'm gonna go over to Christy and then to Leslie. Christy first.
I was just thinking sort of two things. Being part of the SFU gang with Eileen a couple of years ago, and being part of many workshops through UBC and other places. It is interesting to be around other writers who are clearly committed to their story, and you're like, but it's really bad, you know? And you can't say it's really bad, but it's like, but this is never going to go anywhere. This is really, really bad. But I guess that's why I find it really important to be parts of groups like this, because and showing your work to other people. So you're not always going to get consistent feedback. Some people are going to like it, some people are going to hate it, whatever. But I think if you get in with good, trusted people, that can help guide some of your decision making too. And that's why I value this gang so much. It's really important to me. But yeah, I must say I have run into people and I'm just like, this ain't gonna go anywhere, buddy. Like it's just bad, and you feel badly because you can't just come out and go, well, this is horrible. Like you can't do that.
Yeah, no, you shouldn't do that. But you may end up coming back and saying, like, and I think it's important to give people the feedback if their story has no resonance with you. So, for example, I don't read a lot of fantasy. It's just not normally my jam, and I won't pick it up. Having said that, a well-crafted fantasy, so I'm going to use two examples, one which will make someone blush, is if you had said to me, do I care at all about dragons? I would have been like, no. And now all of a sudden, Bonnie's been working on this story where suddenly I am deeply invested in these baby dragons, to the point of which I have to send her notes, which like, if you kill that dragon, I will kill you. So it's become personal for me now. Even if it's something like, and Christy will recognize this, there was a student, Elise, in our group who was writing a very dark fantasy that was very much not my jam, but she had a compelling story, and that story is what worked. And when you can marry those two together, and I think Odette put it really nicely, your story shouldn't just be the clothes hanger for your fancy clothes. Like, it really should be a working human body. So you'll hear sometimes people talk about what is the spine of my story, which I think is such a nice way of putting it, which is like, what is the backbone, which is the nerve center. Like those of us who like biology, our spine is our nerve center. It's where everything is connected. How you move forward, your spine is sending messages back and forth with your brain, and you're moving your muscles and you're moving those all along. So you need, I think a really well done thing has structure because that's what's moving it forward. But you can get by with a really good story because it will be so interesting that you almost don't notice that it's not moving. Right? I'm going to go over to Leslie, who had a comment.
Well, that kind of leads me right into my question perfectly. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I want to know, especially after what Christy said, how do you know if you have that story that's working? Like, what if I'm one of those people that is so invested in my story, I can't see that it's not working? Like, is there, like, there's so many different genres and styles, but is there like something that makes that spine, like that those essential characteristics that will propel somebody to read it? I mean, I've read that story Trump structure and story genius, and I think I still don't know.
So I'm going to give you a wishy-washy answer. You're welcome. Don't roll your eyes at me. I'm going to tell you that, yeah, there is, like, we do know that there are story structures, and we know that this goes all the way back to mythology. And again, whether you use the term save the cat, whether or not you use the writer's journey, whether or not you use something, like, we know that there is a structure by which people are predisposed to be intrigued in the story. We know that. We also know that in general, people are intrigued by characters. So if you can create a character for which the reader has empathy or interest, they will follow that character and they will have an interest in that person. And I tend to say that it comes in an idea of like an interesting person. I don't like to use the term likable because, for example, one of my favorite books is Gone Girl, which is truly one of the most unlikable people on the planet, are both of those characters, but they are, to me, so unbelievably fascinating. I would follow them in any place. So I'm wanting to have both of those. So we have that. In terms of how do you know if your story, well, apparently, one, you could send it to Christy, and you could be like, Christy, just tell me, is it in fact a hot mess? So that, we can do that. But I think it's really hard to know whether or not it's working. And I think part of that is opening yourself up to some degree of feedback and hearing from people, particularly feedback from people who you would say are your target readers. I think it is much harder to create a story that is compelling for someone who isn't your target reader, because they're just not as inclined. Also, your target reader is much more likely to know if something is a cliche. So for example, because I don't read fantasy, I might be going along with something that someone who read fantasy would be like, no, everybody always has that happen. Like, yawn, that's 2 days old and not at all interesting. Or that's breaking some sort of genre rule. Marianne and I have had talks before, because I am not a traditional romance reader by and large. I read some, but it's not my go-to genre. I tend to probably prefer women's fiction. And I know Marianne has had the feedback before, like, is she writing romance? Is she writing women's fiction? And is she sometimes writing in between? And then as a result of that, having challenges that come from those readers' expectation. So you have to kind of get it out there and get that feedback from people. And then sometimes you have to give it space. I'm just reading the chat here. And this is interesting, Odette saying that sometimes you don't even know until you have it in front of readers. And, by readers, like, not people that you know, but people who are actually just out there in the wild, reading books and talking about books and having that. And even then, I don't know if you necessarily know. Why one story is more successful than another is sometimes of a mystery. And I actually would take a lot of heart, Leslie, that if the people who are the readers are liking your story, that's usually a better sign than worrying about whether or not the gatekeepers are liking the story. I also think you get better at knowing. I've been writing for a while now, and I can read my own stuff back and know, I wouldn't say phoning it in because I've never phoned it in, but I can look at my own writing and know, like, I really pushed myself there. That's a really good chapter, or this chapter is going to need work on revisions. I'm getting better at knowing that when I read my own stuff, which I didn't used to be. I used to have only two speeds. I would read my stuff and either think it was genius, and I could not wait for the rest of the world to see it, because I was, and I would never understand when they would get rejected, or I would think it was utter crap. And of course, no one ever bought it because it was horrible and no one was ever going to read it. And those were the only two speeds that I had. Whereas now I am much better at reading my own writing and being like, the pacing's not quite right here when I look at it. I can make this better. Something about this character that's not quite connecting, or I made that too easy. So I'm much more able to sort of see some nuances other than yes, no. All right, I have one more lie I'd like to tackle today. And I have like pages of these because you guys all wrote them in. So clearly we're not going to get through all of them today. But one of the ones that came up is you should never start a book with dialogue. Show of hands, how many people agree? Never start a book with dialogue. All right, we have Odette. Anyone want to chime in with Odette? Everyone else is holding out. All right, so Odette, I know you are a typer rather than a speaker, so I'm going to have you type why you think you should never start with dialogue. And
I mean, I can
never say never. Fine, Bonnie. Why you should? Oh, go ahead, Odette.
I think when I open a book and someone's speaking, I don't know. I have to. Where are they? Who are they? What's the context? It makes me. It's an unnecessary piece of work that I have to do as a reader that I shouldn't have to do. Like the author should be pulling me into the story, not making me guess the second I launch into the story, what's happening, who's speaking, who are they talking to. I just think it's really lazy. Like, people make these shock statements and that's supposed to draw people in. And I think it's just a crutch, actually. And it just totally turns me off. Like, I will open a book, see dialogue, and shut it. That's just me.
I love Odette. She's like, damn, I'm out. And I'm suddenly thinking back, like, have I ever used dialogue as an opener? Now I got to remember. I think the reason that people do it is because we've all heard, like, oh, you have to have this great opening line. And so people want to have an opening line. And dialogue is often a place where you can have someone can say something quite startling or shocking or impactful, and so people want to start with that line of dialogue because they're hoping it will have which is clearly the opposite feeling that Odette had, which is like, who said that? Oh my gosh, I'm so intrigued about what would make someone say that I'm going to keep on reading and be compelled to go into that story. I think the reason people advise against it is exactly the reason that Odette is bringing up, which is sometimes if you don't know who that person is it necessarily shocking? So for example, if I had the dialogue line, screw you, humanity is horrible, and I don't like anyone in this world, Christy said. If we know Christy, then we have that thing where we're like, what? That is shocking. That is not something that Christy would say. But if you don't know Christy, it's not necessarily that much of an impactful line because I don't know her, right? Conversely, if you have a line that says, I feel like killing myself, Eileen said. I won't put that on anyone else. Eileen said, right? Like, you may have an automatic thing where you're like, oh, well, I hope Eileen doesn't do that. But if you don't know me, you don't necessarily care about what happens to me, which is one of the reasons sometimes, again, I think people often will open with strong action scenes because they've heard, like, you got to start off with a bang. So I'm going to tie this child to a bomb and put the mother in charge of, getting it, taken care of in the next few paragraphs. And it does have some action and it has some things that are going on with that. But the challenge, of course, becomes if I don't necessarily care about either the kid or the mom, it's more of an idle interest as to whether or not if they get blown up is that big of a deal for me. And in fact, sometimes in books, I know that characters early on are going to die anyway, so I'm not necessarily overly invested in them. So if you are going to open with a line of dialogue, I think like anything, you should ask yourself, why? Like, what is it that you are hoping to achieve with that? And is there something about it that would work? Does anyone want to argue why you want to have a really good line of dialogue? Denise.
Hi. I just read The Golden Notebook by Doris Lessing again. Like 100 times maybe, and it starts with sentence is that it starts with children who are alone in the room, just one sentence, and then jumps to the dialogue between students, but we get to know them right through the dialogue. And it really puts you into that room, just watching them talk to each other. And I think it's a very good way to introduce these characters talking to each other. They haven't seen each other for a long time. You understand that. And it was very well written, so I think it can work sometimes.
All right, you cut out in there, and that might have just been me because I have the intertubes. No, other people said no too. Okay, good. So I think what I would say is, and I think this is probably, Denise isn't the only one who can point to a book that opens with a line of dialogue that they love, that instantly pulled them into the story. And I think someone earlier had mentioned that a lot of certain genres, so science fiction came up as one that might open with a lot of dialogue lines, and that it might be something that works out particularly well for them. Anyone else want to make the argument for dialogue as an opener? Oh, you were all like pro dialogue first, and now you're not so sure. Tracy.
So I know the argument might be that you don't care about the person because you don't know them yet, but a dialogue with something, say, like, I'm going to kill myself, lost it. It makes you go, what? What's going on? Like, what happened? Like, almost pulled me in a way, because I want to know why such a shocking sentence is the start of a story, and what happens to bring that person to that point. What's going to happen after that. All these factors. So I think sometimes it depends on what it is that's being said, and the way it's delivered and what comes after it can really pull you in super quick.
All right. Leslie, were you going to add to that?
No, what I was going to say is sometimes if it's just a single line followed by some physical actions and then you're grounded, you get a lot of insight into that character, that they would start by saying something that's really out there, like the first time I died, I was 15, and like they're telling you a story. I think in those cases, I think it can work when they're almost breaking that wall, and talking to the reader. Then I think it can work. But I mean, like you say, there's exceptions to every rule, right?
And I think the biggest thing that I come up to, Odette saying, she caught you using the term lazy writing, which is, I think it is that thing where sometimes we're trying to trick the readers into liking our story. And so we're trying to come up with something. So thinking about why you would open with any particular place. And for me, openings are interesting because I have some place that I start, I write the book, and I often then rewrite the opening scene because, one, I know the characters way better, and two, I have a much better sense of how the book needs to open because of how the book ends. So I want to show that kind of full range of things. So I often am sort of changing it up later. So again, this is a big thing. Like, if the first thing that comes to you is a line of dialogue, write that sucker down, keep writing, and go. When you go back, you're going to go back and you're going to make a decision about if that is the place to open. And you want it to be a place where it truly is the best place. You have to know that there are going to be some people, I don't know, let's call it Odette, who's going to do it if you choose to open with a line of dialogue, who is going to shut that book, put it back on the shelf, and be like, nope, and not be interested in that. There may be someone else who's going to read that opening line and be like, Tracy's going to read that opening line and be like, oh my God, I'm so intrigued. I absolutely have to buy this book to find out what's going on. And then there may be a whole bunch of people who may be somewhere in the middle, who other things are going to make the difference as to whether or not they continue to pull on with that. I think what you always wanted to remember is that you're trying to create stuff that intrigues and pulls the reader in. But as we've talked about before, you're not trying to create confusion. Mystery, good. Confusion, bad. So you're trying to make sure that you're writing those lines. Going back just to the chat, Alyssa asked, is there more space for it in sequels where you might know the characters already? I think sequels always are a different thing. in terms of you might open with a line that, again, where people know the people, where it's a fun place to open because maybe you have the character saying something they normally wouldn't say. And so a reader who's read those things before is going to be intrigued or excited to sort of see what they're happening. Christy points out that a lot of YA books are first person. So it's basically, it's internal dialogue that you're often starting with, right? So I never knew the reason for my parents' divorce, but the year of my 9th grade, I would find out for sure. Like, it's often in internal lines of dialogue that are happening. So that's happening. So then there's a couple examples in the chat window as well, where you might have a line and then they start talking. So there's sort of an ongoing conflict. So I'm reading as I go. So what I would say is I certainly think that you can have it. Odette and I can arm wrestle about this. I wouldn't say that it's a deal breaker for me. I would say make sure, like anything, that you're using it with the purpose of somehow bringing your, and if you're doing it just to try and shock the reader or say something that would be so startling, like, well, they'll have no choice but to keep reading now, and that's not the rest of the story that you're going to have, one, it's a false promise. I really think, and again, not to put too much pressure on your first line, but you're really trying to set a whole story in some ways in that first line where people have a sense of the tone and the feel and expect. And so that can be putting a lot onto that. So that's something I would think about. Other comments about that? All right. Well, we have so many more rules that we will not get to today because we only have 5 minutes. So that's not going to work very well. So I am making a list of these, and if people find this interesting, yes, no, we will hit more of them because we have all sorts of good things to talk about. And until then, are there any other questions for today? No. Christy.
It's not so much a question, it's just kind of a personal observation for myself, is that sometimes I think we can get enamored with that notion of, oh, I want to write the next great novel. And so we kind of get all consumed with this thing. But we're actually really good at children's books. And so I'm sort of, it's funny right now, in my art world, I've been doing a lot of painting, a lot of different mixed media. That's what I teach. But my first love is drawing. And although I teach it, I've kind of downplayed it. And then over the past couple of weeks, I thought suddenly, oh yeah, like I want to do this little book about my cats. And I think I'll draw them. And I'm having so much fun with it. And I'm realizing I'm a drawer. You know, and so I should be drawing these things. And although it's not taking me away from the next great international bestseller, I think sometimes we just have to recognize, yeah, you're really good at that, so do that.
Yeah, I mean, two things that you know, sort of spurred this discussion for me, which I think is useful, is one, there's a little bit of a thing going around on Twitter where they're telling writers to put down what they do really well. And a lot of people struggling with that because it feels awkward. So that is, Odette's throwing down a challenge for people. So keep the hold of this because I want to see it. She's saying anyone shows the first sentence in a book, only the first sentence, that's dialogue, that's better than a first sentence that's not dialogue. So throw down, people. There's some things in there. But what I would say, going back to, is the idea of knowing what we're good at and what we enjoy doing and feeling comfortable in that place. For me, for example, writing humor has always come a little bit easier to me because that's the way I see the world. But I think of it as not, quote unquote, real writing, which is interesting. Whereas other people are like, oh, I try to be funny and it's really hard for me to do that. But for me, because it came easy, I felt like it didn't count. And it was only stuff that I was really trying hard on that counted as real writing. So I think yeah, the idea that we undervalue the things that come more easily to us is true. And the second thing that I have struggled with my whole writing career is the lie that there is a right way to write, and that if I could only learn that right way, that I would, something very good happened to Leslie.
Not me, but somebody in this group.
It's not her secret to share, I'm guessing.
No, but she should share it.
All right. Well, now I'm waiting. Okay. So what I will say is that there was a right way to write. And if I could only figure out what that right way is, then I would, automatically be off to the races and doing things. And so I would try all these things that other people were saying, particularly at conferences. I was very, I'd go to a conference and I would hear somebody say something. I'd be like, Odette would be on the panel and she would say, never start with a line of dialogue. I'd be like, I'm never going to do that again. And then I would go to another panel and someone else would say, like, I collage, like, anyone who's not making a vision board before they do a book is a fool. And I'd be like, I have to do vision boards. And someone else would be, a plotter. And I'd be like, I should plot. Someone else would say, if you plot, you're killing the story. I'd be like, I'm killing the story. So I would kind of swing back and forth with all of those different things. But what it really comes down to in the end is what works for you and what works for the readers that you're trying to reach. And on that note, we're going to call it a day. So I'm going to tell everyone to have a good day, and I will see you around the Creative Academy. Take care, everyone. I'm going to stop recording.